By the time the police arrived, the alley was quiet again. One man was standing. The other was seated against the wall, breathing hard, his weapon no longer in his hand. There were no sirens in the story, people later told, only the sound of footsteps fading, and a decision already made. Witnesses said it ended before they understood what had begun. No prolonged struggle, no display. The report would later note the absence of visible injury on one side and the presence of sudden compliance on the other. What happened in that narrow Hong Kong alley in 1970 did not look like a fight. It looked like a conclusion. The alley was not a place where things happened loudly. It was a service passage, narrow enough that two men walking toward each other would instinctively turn their shoulders. The walls were close, worn smooth by years of contact delivery carts, refuse bins, the occasional hurried step taken to avoid the street. Light reached it indirectly, reflected rather than cast, leaving long stretches in partial shadow even during the day. That evening in 1970, the hour mattered as much as the space. Shops had closed, the city's volume had dropped. Not into silence, but into a lower register, footsteps instead of engines, voices instead of crowds. People moved with purpose, not curiosity. In such places, attention narrowed naturally. No one lingered. Witnesses later struggled to describe why the moment felt different before anything occurred. Nothing about the alley suggested confrontation. Yet the conditions removed the usual delays that allow situations to dissolve on their own. There was no room to circle, no audience to perform for, no distance to negotiate safety. In confined spaces, intentions become visible quickly, not through words, but through posture and timing. Those who passed through that alley regularly understood its limits. If something went wrong there, it would resolve itself quickly or not at all. The walls offered no protection. The ground offered no advantage. Movement was forward or backward, nothing else. This was not an environment where prolonged exchanges made sense. Bruce Lee entered that space without announcement, not in the dramatic sense, no sudden appearance, but simply as someone moving through a place meant to be passed through. He was dressed plainly. Witnesses recalled nothing remarkable about his clothing, only that he walked without hurry and without distraction. He was not scanning. He was not avoiding. His attention appeared settled, already placed. At that stage in his life, he was visible in the city, but not insulated by it. Fame had not yet created distance. People still encountered him in ordinary spaces on streets, in stairwells, near storefronts closing for the night. That familiarity carried a tension of its own. Recognition did not guarantee respect, and respect did not guarantee restraint. The alley did not belong to either man who would soon occupy it. It belonged to function, not identity, and because of that, it stripped away the usual signals people rely on: crowds, exits, authority figures. What remained was proximity and decision. Those later asked to describe the beginning often disagreed on the exact second it started. Some said it was when voices lowered. Others pointed to a pause in walking, a moment when forward motion stopped without explanation. What they agreed on was simpler. Once both men were fully inside the alley, the outcome was already narrowing. Nothing in that space allowed for escalation without consequence, and nothing in that hour allowed for hesitation to be corrected later. The alley had made its terms clear long before either man spoke. By 1970, Bruce Lee did not move through Hong Kong anonymously, but neither did he move with ceremony. His presence carried ahead of him in fragment stories overheard, demonstrations remembered, opinions argued secondhand. People recognized the name before they agreed on what it meant. To some, he was an actor who moved differently than others on screen. To others, he was a teacher whose ideas unsettled established hierarchies. And to a smaller group, he was a question that had not yet been tested publicly in the way they believed mattered. Reputation in those years did not function as protection. It functioned as invitation. The more visible Lee became, the more he attracted comparison, not from institutions, but from individuals. Men who measured skill through challenge rather than study. Men who believed certainty could be proven quickly, decisively, in front of witnesses or not at all. What separated Lee from others in similar positions was not confidence, but the absence of display. He did not reinforce his reputation through repetition. He allowed it to exist without maintenance. That restraint created space for misinterpretation. Silence, to some, reads as uncertainty. The man who would soon confront him did not step into the alley seeking conversation. Witnesses later described him as controlled, not erratic. This was not a spontaneous outburst, but a decision carried forward. The presence of a blade was not concealed, but neither was it raised. It was shown in the way tools are shown when they are meant to end a discussion. Those nearby sensed the shift before words were exchanged. Conversations stopped. Footsteps slowed, then continued away. No one gathered. This was not spectacle, it was exclusion. The kind of moment people instinctively remove themselves from. What the challenger believed, according to later accounts, was simple. Space favored him. Fear would shorten reaction, and reputation, when pressed, would yield. What he did not account for was how reputation works on those who do not depend on it. Lee had no need to confirm what others already debated. He did not adjust his posture to announce readiness. He did not speak to establish authority. His stillness did not invite negotiation, but it did not resist it either. Observers later recalled something subtle in that stillness, not tension, but alignment, as if movement had already been resolved internally, leaving no visible excess. This was not the calm of hesitation. It was the calm of economy. The challenger misread this. Many did. They mistook restraint for delay, and delay for weakness. In their experience, dominance arrived loudly or not at all. The alley offered no stage to correct that assumption. As the distance closed, reputation ceased to matter in the way it had outside the passage. What remained was presence measured not by history, but by the next second. And that second was already approaching. The moment did not begin with a shout. It began with certainty. The challenger stepped fully into the alley, closing the last usable distance without urgency. The blade remained visible, angled downward, not yet active. This was deliberate. A display meant to define terms without escalation, to claim control before resistance could organize itself. Witnesses later described the posture as confident, even practiced. The man had chosen the environment well. The walls restricted lateral movement. Retreat would require turning. The narrowness eliminated the possibility of circling or evasion. Everything about the space suggested advantage for the one who arrived, prepared. What he failed to consider was that preparation is relative. Lee did not step back. He did not step forward. His weight settled in a way that suggested neither compliance nor defiance. There was no verbal exchange to slow the moment. No attempt to reason or assert identity. Silence here was not passive. It removed timing cues the challenger expected. In confrontations driven by intimidation, the first movement usually belongs to fear. A flinch, a retreat, a raised voice, something that confirms imbalance. None of that appeared. The absence unsettled the rhythm the challenger relied upon. The blade's presence created a false sense of inevitability. It narrowed the challenger's thinking, reducing complexity to outcome. He believed escalation would be linear, threat, reaction, submission. But confined spaces distort linear thinking. They compress time. Decisions overlap. Control shifts without announcement. Observers later recalled that the distance between the two men felt wrong, too close for deliberation, too far for contact. That in-between space, often ignored, was where the miscalculation lived. It was a range where weapons promise certainty, but do not yet deliver it. The challenger assumed the next movement would be his to choose. He assumed resistance, if it came, would arrive late. What he did not understand was that Lee had already stopped engaging with the threat as an object. His attention was on timing, not the blade itself. On the human holding it, not the metal. On the moment before commitment, not the commitment itself. Several witnesses described the same detail, though none could explain why it stood out. Lee's eyes did not fixate on the weapon. They moved briefly, then settled, not scanning, assessing, as if confirming something already known. The challenger spoke then. The words were not remembered clearly, only the tone. Not rage, assurance. A final attempt to assert dominance before action made it irrelevant. That was the last unnecessary moment. The miscalculation was not technical. It was psychological. The challenger believed the encounter would be decided by what he brought into the alley. He did not realize it would be decided by what he could not take away: composure, timing, and restraint. When the balance shifted, it did so without warning. And by the time witnesses understood that something had changed, the opportunity to intervene no longer existed. Those who later tried to describe what happened next often lowered their voices, not out of secrecy but uncertainty. The sequence resisted retelling. There was no clean beginning they could point to, no single motion that explained the outcome. What they agreed on was duration. It was over quickly, not in the theatrical sense of speed, but in the practical sense of finality. The moment did not stretch. It did not invite interpretation while it was happening. By the time the mind attempted to follow the body had already stopped moving. There was no shout, no collision with the walls. The blade did not fall loudly. It simply was no longer in the challenger's hand. Witnesses differed on how this occurred. Some believed it never had a chance to rise. Others recalled a sudden redirection so brief it appeared accidental. No one described a strike meant to injure. What they noticed instead was the change in posture. The challenger's shoulders dropped first, not in surrender but in loss of structure. The forward certainty that had carried him into the alley vanished, replaced by an instinctive effort to regain balance, physical and otherwise. Control did not transfer, it dissolved. Lee's movement was described as minimal, almost disappointing to those who expected display. There was no pursuit, no follow-up. Once the threat collapsed, motion ceased. He did not advance on advantage. He did not correct the man further. The decisive action was not repeated because it did not need to be. Several witnesses recalled thinking they had missed something, that the resolution must have happened just outside their line of sight. But the alley offered no blind spots. The walls were too close. The light too consistent. What they had seen was all there was. This absence of excess unsettled people more than violence would have. There was no visible explanation proportionate to the outcome. No damage that justified the compliance now evident. The challenger was still upright, still conscious, still alive, and yet entirely finished. He sat down without being told to. The blade lay on the ground between them, no longer relevant, not because it had been neutralized dramatically, but because the person who had brought it no longer believed in its usefulness. Lee did not retrieve it. He did not acknowledge it. His attention was no longer on the object or the man. He had already disengaged, as if the encounter had reached a point beyond which nothing further could be gained. What struck witnesses most was the lack of emotion afterward. No anger released, no relief displayed. Lee's breathing did not change noticeably. His posture returned to what it had been moments earlier, settled, unhurried. The moment had not been about winning. It had been about ending. And endings, when done properly, do not require emphasis. By the time sound returned to the alley, the distant echo of footsteps, a door closing somewhere above the situation, had already stabilized. There was nothing left to interrupt, only the recognition that something decisive had occurred without asking permission to be remembered. After the movement ended, nothing rushed in to replace it. The challenger remained seated against the wall, his back straight at first, then gradually loosening as the reality of the moment settled. He did not reach for the blade. He did not stand. He did not speak. The confidence that had shaped his entrance into the alley had nowhere to return to. What replaced it was not fear in the dramatic sense, but recalibration, a rapid internal adjustment to a conclusion he could not undo. Witnesses later emphasized this part more than the exchange itself. The silence afterward lasted longer than the action. It was heavy, but not tense. The absence of threat was complete enough that no one felt compelled to intervene. There was nothing to stop. Nothing to prevent. Lee stood where he was, neither looming nor retreating. His posture did not communicate victory. It communicated closure. He did not look down at the man for long, and when he did, it was without judgment. Not dominance. Recognition. The challenger's compliance was total, yet unforced. No one had instructed him to remain seated. No grip held him there. His stillness came from understanding rather than restraint. The situation no longer required control from the outside. It had been accepted internally. At some point, Lee stepped back, not away, but out of relevance. The distance was small but meaningful. It returned agency to the other man without reopening the encounter. This detail appeared repeatedly in later accounts. That Lee did not hover. He did not monitor. He trusted the outcome to hold. Police would later note the absence of visible injury. This confused those unfamiliar with confrontations resolved to structure rather than damage. There were no marks that explained the submission, no wounds that justified the surrender. Yet the challenger did not protest when questioned. He did not exaggerate. He did not attempt to reframe the event in his favor. He simply complied. Those nearby understood that whatever had occurred had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The challenger's weapon had not failed. His assumptions had. And once that kind of failure happens in front of oneself, it does not invite immediate correction. Lee left the alley without announcement. No glance back. No comment offered. He did not wait for authorities. He did not claim ownership of the resolution. His departure was quiet enough that some witnesses only realized he was gone when they attempted to describe him later and noticed gaps in their memory. What remained was the seated figure, the discarded blade, and an understanding shared without discussion. The situation was over, and it had ended as efficiently as it possibly could. The lesson had already been delivered. Any further action would only have diluted it. By the time voices returned to normal volume and movement resumed, the alley had returned to its original purpose, a place. People passed through, not a place they lingered. But for those who had seen it, the silence that followed lingered longer than the event itself. Years passed before the alley was spoken of with any consistency. There was no plaque, no official acknowledgement beyond a brief police notation that raised more questions than it answered. The report recorded compliance, a neutralized situation, and the absence of injury that would normally justify such an outcome. It did not attempt explanation. That absence did most of the work. Among law enforcement, the incident circulated quietly as an example of disproportion, without excess and encounter resolved without escalation, yet without ambiguity. Officers who read the report remarked not on technique, but on restraint. The unusual detail was not what had been done, but what had not been required afterward. Among martial artists, the story traveled differently. It lost specificity over time, as such stories do. The alley shifted locations in retellings. The challenger's background became less clear, but the structure of the event remained intact. Narrow space, visible threat, immediate conclusion. No spectacle, no injury, no pursuit. Bruce Lee never publicly addressed the incident. When asked about confrontations in general, he spoke instead about avoidance, efficiency, and the danger of misunderstanding force as aggression. He allowed the story to exist without confirmation. That, too, was a form of discipline. By not correcting the narrative, he prevented it from becoming instruction for imitation. Those who claimed to have been there remembered it less as a fight than as a lesson witnessed unexpectedly. Not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted expectation. Many had grown up believing that danger announced itself loudly, that resolution required visible damage. The alley offered a different model, one where clarity arrived first, and action followed only long enough to restore balance. Over time, the incident merged into the broader understanding of Lee's approach. He was remembered not for how often he engaged, but for how rarely he needed to, not for domination, but for control that made domination unnecessary. The alley became symbolic not because of what occurred there, but because of how little had to occur. People who later trained with him spoke of the same principle applied repeatedly in smaller ways. Movements trimmed of excess, corrections made without humiliation, authority established without insistence. The lesson from the alley was not isolated, it was consistent. Decades later, when the city changed and the passage itself was altered, the story remained intact precisely because it lacked ornament. It survived because it resisted exaggeration. No one could point to a dramatic image that disproved it. No one could reduce it to choreography. What endured was the shape of the event. A challenge entered a confined space. A decision resolved it. Nothing spilled beyond what was necessary. In that sense, the alley never belonged to history as a location. It belonged to memory as a measure, a reminder that mastery, when genuine, does not announce itself. It appears briefly, restores order, and leaves before attention can gather. Those who spoke of it later often ended the same way, not with admiration, but with reflection, with the understanding that the most lasting demonstrations are the ones that do not demand to be remembered. The alley returned to silence long ago. The lesson did not.